Hello, today we're going to be talking about the way tariffs are changing how companies are going to be interacting. And we have on our panel today a bunch of editors from different Endeavor publications. So, Robert, why don't you sort of start us off? How do you see these tariffs? They're changing almost daily these days. You
Sure.
know, what's the impact in the areas you're covering?
So, industry week, we deal with the entire manufacturing industry, and it's been a dramatic 72 hours or so. Just for those who weren't paying really close attention, Saturday afternoon, President Trump signed executive orders instituting 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and an additional 10% on China. These were blanket tariffs on every product. In the case of Canada, it was 25% on most things and 10% on energy products. But these are on top of the first Trump term's China tariffs on steel and aluminum and other finished products that the Biden administration had kept in place. In those cases, we're talking as many as 25 to 30%. So the additional 10% brings it up to around 40% tariffs on any goods coming from China. Well, on goods coming from China in that the steel and aluminum area, and then general products at that 10% level. Um, Within 24 hours, people were reacting, and then Monday morning they dropped the threat on Mexico initially, saying they'll give a 30-day pause while Mexico works on some border security issues. And then by the end of the day, Monday, it was Canada had announced that they'd delayed tariff implementations there. So we're really left just with big changes in China and threats of similar actions in Europe and other Asian countries where we have free trade agreements. What it really comes down to is that Trump has always sort of negotiated in the public space. He'll make a threat of tariffs, followed up usually with some sort of action, but then back down once he gets some sort of other concession from the potential partner. In the case of Mexico, it was more border security. In the case of Canada, it was agreeing to spend some time on the northern border and fentanyl exports from Canada into the U.S., although those numbers were fairly minimal. Same thing's going on with Europe right now, the threat of auto import tariffs and things like this. So we're waiting to see what actual policy will come out of that, if there will be another executive order, and if so, what the end goal is. If it is it trying to protect American production, or is there some sort of other policy initiative that he wants to achieve?
From the discussions I was able to have with some hydraulics and pneumatics companies over the last couple of days, for them it's just bringing a lot of uncertainty, the speed at which the tariffs were put in place, and then all of a sudden kind of somewhat taken away. So it's making it really difficult for companies to plan and make, a lot of them source materials from especially China, but also Canada and Mexico. There's been a lot of reshoring efforts to Mexico for US based companies and otherwise in the market. So it's just causing a lot of issues. And as one executive told me, it was just starting to seem like the fluid power market and its customer segments were starting to maybe turn a corner and head into a better direction. And now any tariffs might throw a wrench in recovery efforts. So, and it's just making things really difficult for people to plan and figure out, do they pass on the cost to customers or do they find other sources for suppliers, which some companies have been working on for quite some time, but it's also not always easy, especially sources other than China. And that's just been a cost-effective source for so many suppliers in for components and the machinery. So it's just making things really difficult for people at the moment.
Mhm. How is it in the electronic side, James?
So sure. So electronics companies are keeping a close eye on the proposed tariffs. I think at this point it's uncertain what the potential impact will be, especially since the proposed policies are changing day to day. But predicting the impact of tariffs on the electronics industry is already kind of a tricky proposition. And that's mostly because the electronics industry has long benefited from a really complex globe-spanning supply chain. So if you look at a modern car, it can contain thousands of electronic components sourced from hundreds of different suppliers based in dozens of nations. And each of those components can also be the result of a remarkably complex supply chain. So for instance, semiconductors, which is one of the areas that I cover for electronic design, Accenture, the consulting firm, estimates that a typical chip and everything used to produce it, all the raw materials that go into it, can cross more than 70 international borders before the final product it's packaged into, what the chip is housed inside, is delivered to, or can be delivered to consumers. So in some cases, these chips are pinballing between countries in various stages of completion. So manufactured in one, packaged in another, tested in yet another, and so on. So the upshot is that there are a lot of opportunities for electronic products to get tangled up in these proposed tariffs, just because of how many different components go into them and the complexity of the manufacturing process for the end product.
James, you mentioned automotive electronics in that, and that brings an interesting issue when it comes to especially the cross Canada, U.S.-Canada trade. If you look at any automotive component, there's a very good chance that the control arm in a Dodge truck could have been forged at a plant in Detroit, moved over to Windsor for some sort of heat treating and machining, sent back to Detroit for some sort of etching process, then sent down to Mexico to be installed in a assembly, and then back up to somewhere in Indiana to be put into a truck. So any single component crosses the border 8, 9, 10 times before final assembly. And if each one of those border crossings leads to some sort of duty or tariff, the cost of production becomes exorbitant very, very quickly. This is, we have an integrated supply chain throughout North America for the automotive industry and a few others. And so detangling that becomes very, very, very complicated. But this is kind of where we have some economic power here in the U.S. that Canada and Mexico do not. Our economy is a consumptive economy, so we are dependent on raw materials coming into the U.S. where we're dependent on finished goods coming into the U.S. But most of our economic activity is generated by consumers. So as opposed to Canada and Mexico, which survive off of exports. So they're actually more dependent on our dollars than we are on their goods to a large degree. Even though this could shut down U.S. production, it would do far more damage to Canada and Mexico. And so there is a big club to be used here, and Trump is using in that respect. We do have a lot of economic clout globally. Whether or not it's worth alienating allies is another question, but
Well, along those lines, especially in terms of the supply chain, Sarah, you talk about some of the components that are being used in your systems and why they may be difficult to replace. I mean, that's going to be a big challenge. It's not just that, we will be paying more for them, but are they going to be available?
Like I said before, so much is sourced, things like rubber for hoses. That comes from a lot of other countries. There's not necessarily a lot of US production for that these days. There's more sensor integration and electronics integration going on within the fluid power industry as well. And that stuff is, again, still sourced from other places. Even the move to electrification, there's a lot more integration with battery technology and hydraulics and pneumatic, well, more so on the hydraulics side. So that again, on the electric vehicle side, so much of that battery technology is coming from other sources. Again, like I said, it's going to be difficult. The one executive I spoke to said the steel tariffs on Mexico and Canada could cause price increases for them because like hydraulic cylinders, steel is a big component of that. It's just, everyone's just really kind of uncertain of where they're going to get things if it's not already made here in the US or easily sourced from Canada and Mexico.
Now, one of the challenges that we're potentially looking at are because the costs are going to be increasing across the board in various places, it potentially may be putting companies out of business, which may be in the US, but it may be elsewhere. And they could be providing components that are going to become critical to the production or test. James, you were talking before about the significant amount of interrelationship within electronics. How do you see this, affecting people if various companies start dropping out?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. My immediate thought relates back to what Sarah was talking about, just in terms of these, critical components that you currently can't find elsewhere. One major concern in the electronics industry around these potential tariff hikes, specifically the ones on China, relates to the fact that China is the world's largest producer of printed circuit boards, which are what chips and other components are soldered and placed on before the whole assembly is put into a product. And it's not clear that it would be very easy to relocate that production elsewhere to countries that have better relationships with the United States, or even into the United States itself. And so a tariff hike on just that very essential component would have pretty wide-ranging impacts for the electronics industries, just because you can't really source them easily from many other locales.
One of the challenges we had, I guess, back with COVID was on various cars not being able to be produced or actually sold because they were missing a component. Robert, could you talk a bit about, various industries that are out there that you cover that would be essentially in this same boat should something like this happen?
Sure. I mean, we've talked about the auto industry quite a bit. North American automotive production really cannot take place without easy flow of goods between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. So that would be one of the immediate ones. We could, thinking back to the early days of COVID, especially late 2020 into 2021, the semiconductor shortage that really hit a lot of industries. The automotive was very hard hit, but not just automotive. You had a lot of industrial equipment makers couldn't get the circuit boards and the electronic components, and it really came down to back then was the computer game, the Xbox type people and PCs and things like this. They pay a higher premium for semiconductors than a lot of other businesses. When you start talking about what goes into a car, these are fairly low end and they're very commodity price based. So when the chip companies had a choice on who to sell to, well, they sold to their highest margin customers first, and whatever was left would go to some of these discounted mass market brands. So a lot of consumer products were really far down that list. A lot of industrial products were really far down that list. So if we end up with a repeat of that, if we end up with a new semiconductor shortage, not likely a semiconductor shortage, but a new electronics component shortage, because the semiconductor supply chain feels a little healthier now than it did back in 2020. But if we have a shortage of those printed circuit boards, a shortage of those semi-finished components, that's going to hit, I would imagine, the auto industry first. The second would be like the tractor, construction equipment people, moving into the hydraulics, pneumatics, into the people who make any kind of industrial equipment. It's basically to be reverse order of the profit margins you generate for your customers. And the higher your volumes, the less likely you are to be paying real premiums for your products. So the specialty companies will probably keep their supplies really strong and healthy. So your gadgets, your set-top boxes for your televisions and things like that, that's going to keep coming. What's going to go away are the big ticket items where the electronic components are a very small portion of the overall device.
Well, one of the big challenges we've had essentially within the past week is the fact that the changes that are coming out of the White House have been fast and furious, and they keep flip-flopping from one to the other, changing what's going on. Most companies can't keep up that quickly, and even if they do, they run the risk of obviously making the wrong decision, which may be affected by changes in the future. How do you see companies taking a look at what's going on? Are they going to be holding back? Are they going to be trying to be more conservative?
So far I haven't really heard much on that front from companies. I think everybody's just kind of in a wait and see mentality, which is unfortunate because that was most of last year as well, leading into the presidential election, because we were hearing a lot of people were holding off on making bigger business investments to see who was going to wind up in the White House and what their policies would wind up being, such as tariffs. So that didn't help the fluid power industry and some of its customer markets like construction equipment or manufacturing equipment. And then that's kind of probably what's going to continue here going forward, because they don't know what those costs actually are going to wind up being from any tariffs that get put in place, and if tariffs that other countries might put on US goods, like China has enacted on US goods, like agricultural equipment. That's like one of the biggest markets for especially hydraulics, but pneumatics as well. And that was already a down market. And now to have exports of that machinery to China and other countries being tariffed, that doesn't bode well. But people just don't know what that cost will be and how they will have to potentially pass it on to their consumers, or if they can absorb some of the costs. So it's just that wait and see mentality, which is not helpful for anybody.
Not at all.
Honestly.
Not at all. I mean, I to some degree, I think what you're seeing is the chaos is the strategy. If you are a company out there and you're wondering, how do I wait and respond to this tariff? Do I wait for the next one? Do I wait for this piece of information? Do I wait for the next piece of legislation? The answer to all these questions is, well, if you increase your manufacturing footprint in the United States, you'll be protected against all of this. If you're buying parts from a supplier in Thailand and you have a choice for a more expensive one from a supplier in Indiana, yeah, this sort of pressure campaign makes it much more attractive to buy from that domestic source. And that is the Trump administration's end goal here for a lot of this, is to bring as much manufacturing back into the US as possible. Whether that's realistic or not, it's another question. You know, is there enough capacity in this country to meet all of that
Mhm.
increased demand? But having us constantly debate this, you know, talking about this tariff this week, the European tariffs next week, this is part of a strategy that is meant to say, you know, if you're tired with the chaos, we have a solution for you.
Mhm.
I was going to be obviously focusing on tariffs, but James, I was wondering if you could comment with respect to the CHIPS Act and semiconductors, because that's one area where bringing something back to the US is not going to happen quickly, if at all. We do have a lot of semiconductor manufacturing in the US, but a lot of it is for sensors that use a completely different technology, at least in terms of complexity, compared to TSMC in Taiwan, that are generating the major processors and the AI accelerators that everybody wants to buy these days.
In the US, the CHIPS and Science Act has spurred a lot of new investment in semiconductor manufacturing across the board. You know, you have in Arizona, you have TSMC, as you mentioned, the world's largest contract manufacturer for chips. They are ramping up their, I guess what you could call their flagship US facility for high-end semiconductors. Intel is investing a lot of money around the country to sort of ramp up its production of advanced chips. Even, you know, in terms of chips based on legacy process technologies, Texas Instruments in Texas and in Utah is ramping up its production there to cover sort of more of the getting the US into a place where more of the bill of materials of an electronic product can be fulfilled in the US. So that there is progress there, and I think you know, there's the potential for these tariffs to continue that progress. You know, whether the CHIPS Act survives the Trump administration is, I think, a separate question, and could affect how the reshoring effort that it kicked off will evolve. But getting back to what I was saying before about just the complexity of a lot of these products is, while we can potentially reshore specific parts of the electronic supply chain, like specifically semiconductors in the US, there's still a whole other, plenty of other components and products that just we don't have the manufacturing capacity for in the US, such as, circuit boards, which I brought up earlier. So it's kind of a tricky situation where companies have maybe more flexibility than they did, 5-10 years ago to buy semiconductors in the United States. But for all the other components on the bill of materials, it's they're still drawing from a very international supply chain for those.
Great. Well, I think we need to wrap up at this point, but I wanted to thank everybody for getting on. I'm sure we're going to be doing this again because one thing that isn't going to change is having no changes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.